Thank you for speaking with Bloomberg, Secretary General.
It's a pleasure.
É grande prazer te ver aqui.
Muito obrigado.
Your spokesman recently announced that you will be meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday. Can you speak about what will you emphasize during this meeting, please?
Well, we have many issues of common interest at the present moment. Vaccines, climate, and of course many security situations around the world. We have Afghanistan, but we have Syria, we have the Middle East peace process, we have Yemen. So many situations in which the dialogue with the President of the United States is extremely important for me. I will obviously meet President Joe Biden, as I will meet all the heads of state and government that will be coming for the General Assembly.
Now, you and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson are convening a roundtable on Monday on climate to try to ratchet up commitments ahead of COP26. What are you expecting from that meeting? What do you hope to make progress on specifically?
For me, the meeting is essentially a wake-up call. We are on the verge of a disaster, and there is a risk of a failure for the COP26. If you look at the last data that was published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was clearly stated that things are getting worse than what it was forecasted, and that we have truly a code red in relation to climate evolution. On the other hand, yesterday we had a publication by UNFCCC, that, as you know, is the organization of the UN that supports the COP, the international gathering on climate, saying, first of all, that with the so-called national determined contributions, the commitments made by member states according to the Paris Agreement about what they decided to do, if we take the ones presented until now, we will not reach 1.5 degrees of temperature rise at the end of the century. We will reach 2.7 degrees. And this is a catastrophic situation. And worst, according to those commitments made until now, when the scientific community tells us that we need to reduce emissions by 45% in the decade between 2020 and 2030, the present commitments lead to an increase of emissions of 16%. So, I mean, either countries understand that we are on the verge of a disaster and change course, many of them, others have done a lot and we have to recognize that, or we risk to have a COP26 that fails and we need to face a catastrophic situation in relation to climate. And I believe that this meeting is a very important meeting for a wake-up call with heads of state and government of developed countries, to make sure developed countries are able to correspond to the commitment made to provide financial and technical support to developing countries, namely the $100 billion per year that should be provided. And also the understanding that the impacts of climate change are so devastating, namely in the developing world, small island development states, African countries, but even in the United States, let's be clear, the impacts are so devastating that we need to have half of the climate finance for adaptation to build resilience of the communities, and for the moment it's only 20%. So there are clear requests to developed countries, and also let's be clear, also emerging economies need to commit to more, need to be part of the reductions program. And until now, many emerging economies have objectives that are not ambitious enough. I'll give you an example, coal. If all the coal power plants that are planned at the present moment would be operative, we would no longer be able to reach 1.5 degrees. We would be above the 2 degrees, which means that the objectives, the targets of Paris would go up in smoke. So, I mean, it is clear that we need to create conditions. I suggested today in the summit hosted by President Biden, we need coalitions of countries that have the finance and the technological capacity with the countries that are still too dependent on coal to make sure that we have a quick transition. Because with the present pattern, of energy transition in the world, we will not get there. So this wake-up call is, I think, essential to make sure that countries are able, from now to the COP, to present new commitments, to engage in a positive way in international cooperation, if we want the COP to be a success and if we want to rescue the planet.
Now, as you mentioned, a lot of focus has been on the role of the large countries such as the U.S. and China, and rightfully so. But these emerging countries like Indonesia and India, are they falling short? What are the things that they need to do as soon as possible?
I think what is important is to help them in energy transition and in other aspects. These countries have development problems that we need to recognize. They say, and it is true, that it was the developed world that has put most of the CO2 that is today in the atmosphere. But it is also true that if these countries do not reduce their emissions, there is no solution. And so what we need to have is support to these countries. As I said, coalitions of countries that have financial capacity and technological capacity to help them avoid, for instance, building new coal power plants. That will be stranded assets in the near future because they will not be profitable in the future. Today, we see that they are no longer profitable in the majority of the countries of the world, and to shift more quickly into renewable energy. But for that, they need finance and they need technical support. And this is what I believe developed countries need to provide. These coalitions, this alliance between North and South, developing is necessary. And we need to bridge the mistrust, the gap of trust that still exists today. Developing countries blaming the developed countries for not providing enough financial support. Developed countries complaining that emerging economies are not doing as much as they should in order to reduce emissions. It's not the time to blame the others. It's the time for everyone to do everything possible to assume their responsibilities and to make sure that we can not go above 1.5 degrees, reach carbon neutrality in the middle of the century, and have a meaningful reduction of emissions in the near future.
If I can shift gears, Secretary General, you've been warning of a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. Do you think Western countries and the international community at large are striking the right balance? Or do you think they need to unfreeze more assets to help the people of Afghanistan?
First of all, humanitarian aid is essential. I've sent my humanitarian emergency relief coordinator and head of our humanitarian affairs office to Kabul, where he was, I think, the first high-ranking international officer that went to engage with the Taliban exactly to create the conditions to allow for humanitarian aid to be distributed according to humanitarian principles, and also to raise awareness of the need to look into a number of important rights, namely women, girls, and several of the aspects that we all have been discussing. After that, we organized a conference in Geneva based on an appeal that was launched by the whole UN system, and we are trying to mobilize the international community to provide humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. But there is another problem, which is the risk of an economic collapse in Afghanistan. And the risk of this economic collapse requires, and of course, independently of the regimes that exist today, of sanctions or others that might be complicated, it requires that quickly the international community finds some mechanisms to inject cash in the Afghan economy to allow for the Afghan economy not to collapse, because if the Afghan economy collapses, it will be a disaster for the Afghan people, and we will see a massive exodus destabilizing the whole region. So we will need waivers in some of the sanctions that were established, even waivers for traveling, waivers for contacts, waivers for a number of other practical things. But we need mechanisms allowing to inject cash in the economy. For instance, if there is no cash in the country, we will not even be able to pay the salaries to our staff doing humanitarian aid. So we might find solutions for these. We had a meeting of the Ministers of Finance of the G7 just a few days ago. I had the occasion to talk to the head of the IMF and to several of the countries involved and say, look, it's not a solution to completely strangle Afghanistan. Independently, of course, of a number of considerations that in relation to recognition and to other aspects depend on whatever happens in Afghanistan. But there is an immediate need to make or to let the Afghan economy breathe. Because if not, we might face a terrible disaster.
Will you bring that up in the meeting with Joe Biden next week?
Of course. And I've been doing it. I already have done it with the United States, as I've been doing with other countries. And I think it's in the interest of everybody. And this has nothing to do with the recognition of the government. I mean, it has to do with making sure that the people of Afghanistan can survive.
Would you consider a meeting with the Taliban at this point?
At the present moment, what we are doing is to send to meet with the Taliban a number of officers that deal with the issues in which the engagement with the Taliban is essential. The political dimension is a political dimension that it needs to be led by member states.
Now, onto another topic that will be very significant for you, I believe, during UNGA, booster shots and donations of COVID vaccine shots. Wealthy nations are giving or considering giving booster shots to their populations while much of the world remains unvaccinated. Are you worried that the booster shots could potentially come at the expense of the unvaccinated as the world tries to increase vaccination?
I think we must go much further than that. The problem we have today is that a country like mine has 80% of the population vaccinated. Fortunately, we have not much vaccine resistance. And we have a number of countries in Africa with less than 2% of the people vaccinated. What we need is a global vaccination plan. And to have a plan, we need to have leading that plan those that have power. And those that have power are the countries that produce vaccines or can produce vaccines if they have licenses and technical support for that, to bring them together with international financial institutions and the World Health Organization, able to deal with the pharmaceutical industry and then solve the problems, intellectual property and others, and of course paying what is needed, because obviously the pharmaceutical industries are not philanthropic organizations, we know that, but to have a global vaccination plan which implies doubling the production capacity, which can be done. We see AstraZeneca produced in different places. I believe even Pfizer now made an agreement with a country to produce there. So but this can be done systematically. Wherever there is a capacity to produce vaccines, vaccines should be produced. And conditions should be created for that. And doubling the production of vaccines and then having a mechanism of distribution that is equitable. That's what we need. Of course, we have all the problems that we mentioned and many others of the present situation, but these are all small aspects of a bigger one. And the bigger one is we cannot deal with this with vaccine nationalism or vaccine diplomacy, or we need to deal with this with a global vaccination plan and bring together all those that have the power to solve the problem.
But do you think there is something problematic about the booster shots that are now spreading throughout the developed world?
I'm not a technician, of course. If to have booster shots in one country means that others will not have shots, of course, this is not the best way to deal with the disease. If the booster shots are not used and then the vaccines go to the as we have seen in many things, to the containers of garbage, then of course the problem is different. But the central question is we need a global vaccination plan. We need to double the capacity of production that exists today and to have a mechanism of equitable distribution, and those that have the power related to this need to come together.
Mm-hmm. Now, leaders are coming from all over the world here to New York, starting already now, but next week. For now, vaccines are not required. They don't need to prove vaccines. Are you worried about the potential for this event to be a super spreader?
First of all, the overwhelming majority of the delegations that will come vaccinated. Second, thanks to the city of New York, we have an installation able to provide tests and vaccines to all delegates. So we are providing this service thanks to the city of New York. On the other hand, the President of the General Assembly issued a note saying that when you, with your document, that you bring with you as a delegate, when you click in your entry, you are assuming a compromise of honor that you have been vaccinated. So with all these, I think that the number of non-vaccinated people that will be there will be very limited. And there is also, as you know, to enter the United States, you are supposed to be tested. And so, I mean, there is a number of rules that the United States that need to be verified, even at the entry of delegations. On the other hand, all the UN staff that will be supporting the General Assembly is vaccinated. And by the way, we have a very high rate of vaccination in UN staff in New York, more than 80%, which shows a very strong commitment. And a number of other measures, everybody will be wearing masks, there is social distancing. So I'm very proud that until today, the United Nations in New York has never been a center of spreading of the virus. Not in the worst moments that we had in the city of New York. We always took the adequate measures to avoid it. And I believe that the measures that were taken in relation to the General Assembly will make sure that we remain, as we are, a non-spreading center.
A final question for you, Secretary General. The U.S. and China relations between those two countries remain poor, to say the least. How would you assess the potential to solve so many of the problems that you've described, from climate change to COVID-19, given the state of U.S.-China relations?
I think it is essential that the relations between China and the United States become functional. And at the present moment, they are totally dysfunctional. And that, of course, has an impact on the capacity or lack of capacity to solve many of the problems that we have in the world because of the importance of these two countries. To become functional, I think we need to clearly distinguish three areas. The areas that are areas of disagreement and necessarily confrontation. And of course, this is the question of human rights. It will be several geostrategic problems, namely the South China Sea, etc. These are areas where they disagree and they fight each other, and it is clear. Second, we need to have areas of which there is cooperation because there are common interests, and I think climate should be an area of cooperation. And then we have a range of areas in which I believe a serious negotiation between the two is necessary. Trade, technology, and related aspects. And the fact is that in the recent past, there has been no serious negotiation on anything. And in trade and technology, there are very important things that need to be put on the table. There are reasons of complaint, legitimate reasons of complaint of the United States in relation to China, maybe also China in relation to the United States. Things need to be put on the table, need to be clarified, and the areas where agreement is possible, reached, where agreement is not possible, not reached. But the idea that we can have a world economy divided into two, with two different sets of rules, two different dominant currencies, with then two different strategies in relation to different internets, two different strategies in relation to artificial intelligence, this will inevitably lead to two different military and geopolitical strategies, and that could be a very dangerous thing for the future.